At 5 in the morning, my daughter-in-law, Monica, was screaming my name, completely hysterical. I had changed every lock on the doors of my Gold Coast mansion. Minutes later, my son Bradley arrived with a heavy garage sledgehammer. "I am getting in no matter what, you old fool," he yelled, swinging it against the reinforced oak. Then a calm voice behind me said, "Leave it, Harrison. I will handle this." The lock clicked, the door swung open, and what they saw next left them absolutely pale. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and somehow still healing from the deep wounds my own flesh and blood inflicted. As a successful commercial real estate magnate right here in Chicago, I built an empire to give my family everything, but I remained dangerously blind to their toxicity. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and treated your generosity as a weakness. The violent rhythmic thud of the sledgehammer echoing through my silent hallways was something I will never forget. Each impact sent vibrations through the floorboards, rattling the crystal decanter resting on my desk. Outside the thick door of my private study, Monica was pounding her fists against the wood. Her voice usually carefully modulated to sound sweet and compliant. For my benefit was now shrill, desperate, and stripped of all its fake charm. "Break it down, Bradley," she shrieked. He locked the servers. He changed all the administrative passwords. "Break the door before the banks open. We need that transfer to go through right now." I did not flinch. I sat comfortably in the dim light of my office, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my aged single malt scotch, letting the smoky warmth burn down my throat. Another deafening crash hit the door. The heavy brass hinges strained under the force. I stared at the cracking wood, but in my mind, I was looking at the man swinging the hammer. Bradley, my only son. I thought about the very hands gripping the wooden handle of that sledgehammer. On his left wrist, strapped securely, was a $40,000 platinum watch I had bought him for his 35th birthday. I bought it as a gesture of immense faith, hoping the weight of it would remind him of the responsibilities he was meant to carry for our family legacy. Instead, he was using those same hands adorned with my hard-earned generosity to smash his way into my sanctuary. "I am getting in," he roared again, gasping for breath. I listened to their rising panic, feeling a strange, profound sense of calm wash over me. For years I had played the role of the generous provider, the bottomless well of wealth for them to draw from. I bought them their luxury cars. I funded Monica's endless European shopping sprees. I covered the massive deficits in their lavish lifestyle, playing the part of a soft, accommodating patriarch who just wanted to see his family happy and secure. I let them mistake my kindness for foolishness. I let them believe I was a clueless aging man who was gradually losing his grip on reality. They thought I was merely a stepping stone for their greed. They did not realize I was the entire mountain. The heavy oak door shuddered violently. A large, jagged crack spiderwebbed straight down the center panel. Bradley was putting his entire back into it, driven by a desperate, animalistic terror. He was not trying to reach me out of concern or love. He was trying to reach the main computer terminal sitting on my desk, the very terminal I had just used to freeze every single one of his fraudulent offshore accounts. "Harrison," a deep, steady voice spoke from the shadows behind me. I did not turn around. I simply kept my eyes fixed on the cracking wood. "Leave it." "Harrison," the voice continued, smooth and entirely unbothered by the chaos unfolding outside. "I will handle this." Special Agent Victor Mitchell stepped into the dim amber light of my study. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man from the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI, dressed in a sharp, tactical jacket over a dark suit. He had been standing silently in the corner of my office for the past 3 hours, waiting patiently in the dark with me. He walked past my leather chair and placed a firm gloved hand on the brass doorknob. Outside, Bradley raised the heavy sledgehammer for another devastating swing, roaring with exertion. Agent Mitchell unbolted the deadbolt and swiftly pulled the door wide open. Bradley stumbled forward, the immense momentum of his swing carrying him straight into the room. He barely managed to stop himself from falling face first. The sledgehammer dropped heavily to the hardwood floor with a loud, hollow clatter that echoed off the walls. Monica, who had been pressing herself against the hallway wall, froze mid-scream. The silence that instantly descended upon the room was absolute. The air grew thick, suffocating heavy with the sudden crushing weight of their new reality. Bradley slowly looked up, his chest heaving, cold sweat dripping from his forehead. His eyes darted from me, sitting calmly with my crystal glass of scotch, to the imposing figure of Special Agent Mitchell standing directly in his path. I watched the blood drain entirely from my son's face. In a matter of seconds, his skin turned an ashen, sickly gray. His jaw went slack, and his eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror. Monica gasped loudly, taking a trembling step backward. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth. The sheer arrogance that had defined her for years melted away instantly, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, trembling woman who suddenly realized she had walked straight into a devastating trap. "You seem entirely out of breath, Bradley," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through the heavy silence like a razor. "Was it really necessary to ruin a perfectly good oak door?" Dad Bradley stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak that sounded nothing like the aggressive man shouting just moments before. "Dad, what is going on? Who is this man?" Before he could take another step backward, Mitchell moved. With a fluid, practiced motion, the agent stepped fully into the doorway, completely blocking their path to the servers. More heavy footsteps echoed up the grand staircase behind them. Within seconds, a team of 6 heavily armed federal agents moved rapidly into the hallway surrounding my son and daughter-in-law. Their tactical gear was a stark, brutal contrast to the luxurious silk wallpaper of my home. "Bradley Caldwell," Agent Mitchell said, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. "You are under investigation for federal wire fraud, racketeering, and international money laundering. I suggest you keep your hands exactly where I can see them." Monica let out a choked, desperate sob, her knees buckling slightly, as a federal agent stepped up close behind her. She looked at me, her eyes pleading silently, begging for the generous, foolish father-in-law to step in and save them from ruin, just like I had always done before. But I just took another slow sip of my scotch. I looked at the 2 people who had plotted to destroy my mind, drain my life savings, and toss me into a psychiatric ward while they danced on the ashes of my empire. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. The father who would have moved heaven and earth to protect them had died the moment I discovered their true nature. In his place sat the man who had built a massive commercial empire from scratch, a man who knew exactly how to deal with ruthless thieves. How did it come to this? How did a man who loved his family more than life itself end up sitting in his study at dawn watching the FBI strip his only son of his freedom? It did not happen overnight. The betrayal was slow, methodical, and incredibly cruel. It began exactly 4 months ago on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with a terrifying lapse of memory and a quiet, unassuming withdrawal of $250,000. To understand how I orchestrated this midnight strike, and how I turned their sinister plot into the noose that would eventually hang them, we have to go back to the very first red flag. The moment I realized my mind was slipping, and my perfect family was waiting in the shadows with a knife. Let us go back exactly 4 months to the moment the ground first shifted beneath my feet. It was a Tuesday morning in October. I was standing at the head of the long mahogany table in the executive boardroom of Caldwell Logistics. We were finalizing the acquisition of a massive commercial warehouse facility near an international airport. It was a $90 million deal, the kind of aggressive expansion that had defined my career for 40 years. I had the market analysis memorized. I knew the profit margins, the zoning laws, and the projected revenue streams. I built this empire by being sharper, faster, and more relentless than the men sitting across from me. But as I leaned forward to point out a critical flaw in the deal valuation, something terrifying happened. My right hand, resting flat against the polished wood of the table, began to twitch. It started as a subtle vibration in my fingers, something I tried to mask, by balling my hand into a fist, but the tremor quickly traveled up my forearm, turning into a violent, uncontrollable shake. I pulled my hand off the table and gripped my thigh, hoping the heavy fabric of my tailored suit would hide the movement. It did not. The room felt incredibly warm. A thick, heavy fog rolled into my mind, completely swallowing my thoughts. The sharp, clear numbers I had just memorized evaporated into a blur of meaningless shapes. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the faces of the board members started to swim. I opened my mouth to speak, to redirect the conversation, to assert my authority, but no words came out. My tongue felt thick and useless. The confident, commanding voice of Harrison Caldwell was suddenly gone, replaced by the panicked silence of an old man losing his grip on reality. The silence in the room grew heavy and suffocating. 14 top-tier executives, men and women I had personally hired and trained, were staring at me. I could see the confusion shifting into concern, and then far worse, into pity. I needed someone to cover for me. I turned left, desperately looking for my chief financial officer. We had navigated international crises together for a decade. Needing him to read the room and step in, I opened my mouth to call his name. Nothing. My mind was a complete terrifying blank. I stared at a man I had known for 12 years, a man whose children I had sent graduation gifts to, and I could not remember his name. Not his first name, not his last name. It was just a cold void. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The tremor in my right hand was so severe now that my arm was shaking against my side. "Mr. Caldwell," someone asked from the far end of the table, their voice sounding muffled, as if I were underwater. I tried to nod, to project strength, but my breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. It was the most humiliating moment of my entire professional life. I was a titan of Chicago real estate, a man who commanded thousands of employees, and I was falling apart in front of my own board of directors. I felt stripped of all my power, reduced to a fragile, failing body in a tailored suit. I gripped the table edge desperately, trying to anchor myself as the room spun. Just as the panic threatened to swallow me completely, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. It was Monica. My daughter-in-law rushed into the room, her heels clicking rapidly against the floor. Bypassing the executives, she came straight to my side, her face a picture of frantic concern. "Oh, Harrison," she cooed softly, placing a warm, gentle hand on my shaking shoulder. "I told you not to push yourself so hard today. You missed your morning dose." She looked around the table, offering the board members a brave, apologetic smile. "I am so sorry, gentlemen. He has been adjusting to a new blood pressure medication, and it makes him terribly dizzy if he misses a schedule. Please excuse us." She opened her designer handbag and produced a small, unmarked amber pill bottle. Then she pulled out a sleek, insulated silver thermos. "Here, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Swallow this. It is your new medication. And drink some of my special organic herbal tea. I brewed it just for you this morning. It will settle your nerves and lower your heart rate." I was so disoriented, so desperate for the fog to lift and the humiliating tremors to stop, that I did not question it. I took the pill and accepted the thermos. The tea was lukewarm, tasting strongly of bitter earth and overripe chamomile. I drank it down greedily, relying on the woman my son had chosen to protect me. She rubbed my back while I swallowed, playing the devoted caretaker flawlessly in front of my executive team. "See," she whispered, brushing a damp lock of hair from my forehead. "You are going to be just fine. Let us get you home to rest." Within 10 minutes, the violent shaking in my hands began to subside. The tea did exactly what Monica promised it would do. It calmed my racing heart and smoothed out the jagged edges of my panic. But as my personal driver navigated the sleek black sedan through the busy downtown traffic toward the Gold Coast, I realized that the heavy fog in my mind had not lifted. In fact, it had settled deeper into my brain. The panic vanished, replaced by a thick, numbing apathy as I leaned against the cool leather. I watched the towering skyscrapers I had helped finance pass by the tinted windows, feeling utterly detached. Monica sat beside me in the car, quietly texting on her phone, occasionally reaching over to pat my knee with a reassuring smile. When we finally arrived at the mansion, I barely had the energy to walk up the front steps. I retreated straight to my study and sank into my large leather chair. I stared at my hands, which were now perfectly still, but my thoughts were moving through molasses. I felt utterly defeated. I did not suspect Monica. I did not suspect Bradley. I simply sat there in the quiet luxury of my home, surrounded by the wealth I had bled to build, and accepted the most plausible, painful lie a man of my age can tell himself. I was getting old. My mind was failing. The 70 years of relentless work, the stress, the sleepless nights, they were finally demanding payment. I believed my body was simply breaking down. I convinced myself the humiliating episode was the natural progression of aging, a very sad decline. I was so focused on accepting my own mortality that I was entirely blind to the predators circling my throne. I trusted the tea. I trusted the medication. I trusted the smile of my daughter-in-law. I had no idea that the weakness I felt was not time but the methodical poison administered by the people I funded. I had no idea that the weakness I felt was not time but the methodical poison administered by the people I funded. The very next morning, I woke up with a dull, throbbing ache directly behind my eyes. The morning sunlight filtering through the heavy silk drapes felt unnervingly bright and harsh. I pushed myself out of bed, my limbs feeling as though they were filled with wet sand. The tea from the previous night had forced me into a deep, dreamless, and unnatural sleep, but the morning hangover was absolutely brutal. I shuffled slowly toward my private study, instinctively reaching for my tablet. For 40 years, my morning routine had never varied. Before coffee, before breakfast, before uttering a single word to anyone, I checked my financial portfolios. It was the strict discipline that built Caldwell Logistics from the ground up, and not even a failing body could break a 4-decade habit. I sat down heavily in my large leather executive chair, the material cool and grounding against my skin. My right hand was completely steady, thankfully, but my vision still carried a slight, frustrating blur. I opened the secure banking application, carefully navigating through the complex web of holding companies, commercial real estate portfolios, and private equity accounts. The numbers usually sang to me a familiar, comforting language of constant growth and unshakable security. Today, however, a glaring anomaly struck me like a physical blow to the chest. There, sitting right in the legacy trust fund I had established for my future grandchildren, was a massive, completely unauthorized withdrawal. $250,000 gone. Just vanished into a wire transfer, processed late the previous afternoon. The Legacy Trust was a highly restricted, heavily guarded account. It was sacred money specifically designed to sit and accumulate compound interest until Bradley and Monica finally decided to have children. I had set it up meticulously to ensure the Caldwell name would have generational security long after I was gone. Only 2 people in the entire world had the security clearance and authorization codes to move funds from that specific tier of the portfolio: myself and Bradley. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy, and dangerous rhythm against my ribs. The thick, suffocating fog in my brain seemed to recede for a brief moment, pushed back by the sharp, stinging adrenaline of a veteran businessman detecting a critical leak. $250,000 does not simply move by accident. It requires multiple verifications, strict security protocols, and deliberate, calculated intention. I closed the banking application and stared silently at the dark screen of the tablet. My only son had taken $250,000 without asking, without mentioning a single word to me during dinner, and without leaving a clear paper trail of its final destination. A deep, deeply unsettling chill settled into my aging bones. The terrifying physical weakness I had felt just moments ago was suddenly and entirely eclipsed by a cold, calculating anger. I needed to see his face right now. I needed to look him directly in the eye and hear the explanation he would try to spin. I stood up, my posture straighter and firmer than it had been in weeks, and walked out of the study. I found him outside in the sprawling circular driveway of the mansion. The crisp, biting Chicago morning air hit my lungs as I pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors. Bradley was standing next to his brand-new, custom-ordered Porsche Panamera. I had paid for that magnificent car in cash just 3 months prior as a generous bonus for what I assumed was his hard work at the logistics firm. He was furiously wiping a microscopic, invisible smudge off the pristine black hood with a microfiber cloth completely absorbed in the superficial perfection of the luxury vehicle. He wore a tailored Italian suit, flawlessly custom-made, financed entirely by the exorbitant allowance I provided him. He looked every inch the successful corporate heir, a brilliant, shining facade, bought and paid for by my sweat. "Bradley," I called out into the quiet morning air. My voice was incredibly steady, completely devoid of the pathetic tremor that had humiliated me in the boardroom the day before. He jumped violently, dropping the microfiber cloth onto the pristine paving stones. He spun around to face me, a sudden, undeniable flash of sheer panic crossing his features before he quickly masked it with a wide, highly unnatural smile. "Dad," he said, his voice pitching slightly higher than usual. "Good morning. You are up early today. How are you feeling? Monica said you had a really rough time at the board meeting yesterday. You should be resting in bed, taking it easy." I completely ignored the false, sugary concern dripping from his words. I walked slowly and deliberately down the stone steps. My eyes locked directly onto his, refusing to let him look away. I stopped just a few feet away from him, close enough to clearly see the sudden rapid pulse beating frantically in his neck. "I am feeling surprisingly alert today," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and dangerously calm. Alert enough to carefully review the legacy trust accounts before having my breakfast. The color drained from his face instantly. The confident, wealthy, arrogant air vanished in a heartbeat, completely replaced by a terrified, trembling boy caught stealing directly from the cookie jar. His eyes darted wildly toward the heavy front doors of the mansion, then back to his expensive sports car, completely incapable of holding my gaze for more than a second. I noticed a rather large withdrawal. I continued. I let the silence stretch heavily between my words to apply maximum psychological pressure. $250,000 was wired out of the grandchildren trust yesterday afternoon. That account requires secondary authorization, Bradley. My authorization. Yet I do not recall ever signing off on a $250,000 transfer. Bradley opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly against his silk collar. A thin, undeniable layer of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, gleaming slightly in the morning light. He took a small, hesitant step backward, leaning his weight against the cold metal of his expensive sports car as if needing urgent physical support. "Well, Dad," he stammered defensively, his hands fluttering nervously in front of him. "It was, the market. The market has been highly volatile lately. I was just moving some assets around to secure a much better yield for the future. You do not move money out of a restricted generational trust to chase temporary market yields," I said. My voice dropping a full octave, carrying the heavy, crushing weight of 4 decades of corporate ruthlessness. "And you certainly do not ever do it without consulting the primary account holder. Where is the money, Bradley?" He looked physically ill, as if he might vomit right there on the driveway. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly seemed much too large for his rapidly shrinking frame. He wiped his sweating forehead with the back of his trembling hand, leaving a damp streak across his pale skin. "Dad, listen to me, you have to understand the situation. It was an incredible investment. A private, highly lucrative opportunity. Very exclusive and strictly invite-only. I wanted to surprise you with the returns." A surprise I echoed coldly, letting the absolute absurdity of his lie hang in the air. You withdrew $250,000 from your unborn children to surprise me. He was practically hyperventilating now, his chest heaving erratically under his expensive silk tie. Yes, exactly, he gasped, clutching at the pathetic excuse like a drowning man frantically grabbing a piece of driftwood. It was a highly time-sensitive deal. If I waited to explain it all to you, we would have completely lost the window to buy in. You have been so incredibly exhausted lately, Dad. Your memory, your health, it has all been visibly slipping. I did not want to burden you with the complex financial details and stress you out further. I was just trying to protect you. The sheer audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. He was using the very weakness I suffered the day before. The weakness I now heavily suspected was entirely artificial to justify openly stealing from me. He was standing right in front of a luxury car I bought him on the driveway of a massive mansion I owned, desperately trying to convince me that robbing his future children was a noble act of filial devotion. The rage burning deep inside my chest was almost suffocating, but I violently forced my face to remain completely impassive. I watched him squirm, sweat, and weave his lies. I watched the son I had raised unravel into a pathetic, cowardly thief right in front of my eyes. I took a deliberate step closer, invading his personal space. He flinched, noticeably, shrinking back against the car door. If it is a legitimate investment, Bradley, then you will have absolutely no problem showing me the official prospectus, the wire transfer receipts, and the holding company details. I want them sitting on my desk by noon today. Dad, I cannot just produce them that fast. He pleaded, his voice breaking in sheer, unadulterated panic. The broker is overseas. There are massive time zone differences to deal with. The paperwork is still being processed on their end. Please, you have to trust me on this. I am your son. Trust is earned, Bradley, I replied, my eyes boring directly into his terrified soul. And right now you are spending my money significantly faster than you are earning my trust. He looked completely trapped, like a terrified rat backed into a tight corner, desperately searching for an immediate escape route. He opened his trembling mouth to spin yet another completely desperate lie. But before the final words could even leave his lips, the heavy front doors of the mansion swung wide open. The crisp morning silence was suddenly broken by the sharp, deliberate clicking of expensive high heels on the stone steps. The cavalry had officially arrived to save him from my wrath. Monica glided down the sweeping stone staircase of the portico. She wore a tailored beige cashmere coat draped elegantly over her shoulders, her hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. In her right hand she held another ceramic mug of freshly brewed herbal tea, the steam rising softly into the chilled autumn air. Her face was an absolute masterclass in composed, loving concern, completely masking whatever panic she might have felt watching her husband buckle under my direct interrogation. She stepped smoothly between Bradley and me, effectively breaking my line of sight. She placed a gentle hand on his chest before turning her wide, sympathetic eyes toward me. "Harrison, darling," she murmured, her voice a soothing, velvety whisper. "What is all this tension out here in the cold? You are supposed to be resting after yesterday's terrible episode. The doctor was very clear about keeping your stress levels absolutely manageable." I looked at her, noting how effortlessly she weaponized my supposed medical vulnerability. "I am simply trying to understand a rather significant discrepancy in our legacy trust," I replied, keeping my tone entirely mild. "My son seems to be having a difficult time explaining a wire transfer of $250,000 that occurred while I was incapacitated." Bradley opened his mouth, but Monica squeezed his arm, silencing him instantly. It was a subtle gesture, but it told me everything I needed to know about who was truly running the operation. She let out a soft sigh, her shoulders dropping, as if a great burdensome secret was finally being lifted from them. She looked down at the paving stones, and when she raised her head, a single perfectly timed tear welled up in the corner of her eye. "Oh, Bradley," she whispered, looking at her husband with deep manufactured affection. I told you. We should have just told him the truth from the beginning. I knew he would notice the funds moving. He is too brilliant to miss something like that, even when he is not feeling well. She turned her gaze back to me, taking a tentative step forward. Harrison, please do not be angry with him. The money is not gone, and it certainly is not missing. It was meant to be a surprise for you, a very special gift to honor everything you have built for this family. A gift, I repeated quietly, allowing a hint of paternal confusion to enter my voice, playing exactly into the role of the declining patriarch she needed me to be. Yes, Monica said, her voice trembling slightly with manufactured emotion. You have spent your entire life securing our futures. You bought us this beautiful life. But after seeing how exhausted and fragile you have been lately, Bradley was terrified. He wanted to make sure your golden years were absolutely secure. He used those funds to secure a primary silent partnership stake in a new, ultra-premium assisted living and medical care franchise, opening a flagship location right here in the Gold Coast. She reached out and gently took my hand, her skin soft and cool against my calloused knuckles. He just wanted to build something that would directly benefit you, Harrison. Something that would guarantee you have the absolute best, most exclusive care available if your condition worsens. He wanted to handle the entire acquisition himself to prove to you that he could manage complex real estate investments just like his father. He wanted to make you proud. It was a breathtaking performance. If I had not spent 40 years navigating the treacherous, deceptive waters of commercial real estate, I might have actually believed her. If I had not poured out my herbal tea into a potted plant and felt my mind miraculously clear, I might have wept at the sheer beauty of their filial devotion. But my mind was sharp and the logic was fatally flawed. You do not secure a franchise stake by wiring liquid cash directly out of a heavily penalized generational trust fund. You use leverage, you use corporate credit, and you certainly prepare a comprehensive term sheet before a single cent leaves the bank. The story was a fabricated shield constructed hastily to cover a massive bleeding wound. Yet standing there in the crisp morning air, I realized the immense power of playing the fool. If I shattered their lie right now, I would force their hand. They would scramble, hide the money trails, and potentially accelerate whatever sinister plans they had in store for me. I needed time. I needed to uncover the true destination of that wire transfer, and I could only do that if they believed I was completely pacified. I let out a long, heavy breath, allowing my shoulders to slump, as if the weight of my own aging body was finally too much to bear. I looked down at Monica's hand holding mine, and then shifted my gaze to Bradley, who was watching me with breathless, agonizing anticipation. I let my eyes soften, replacing the ruthless glare of a corporate titan with the tired, loving gaze of an elderly father. "Is this true, Bradley?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You did this to secure a medical care facility for me." Bradley nodded frantically, practically vibrating with relief, as he realized Monica had successfully thrown him a lifeline. "Yes, Dad. Absolutely. I just wanted to take the burden off your shoulders for once. I wanted to show you that I can protect our family too. I am so sorry I did not tell you, but the non-disclosure agreements were incredibly strict, and I really wanted to surprise you with the final portfolio next week." I stood in silence for a few moments, letting them sweat, letting them feel the precarious nature of their deceit. Then I slowly reached out and placed my hand firmly on Bradley's shoulder. I offered him a warm, forgiving smile. "I appreciate the sentiment, son," I said softly. "I really do. It is a very thoughtful gesture, especially given how difficult things have been for me lately. But please, no more financial surprises. My heart cannot take the stress of missing funds. Next time you want to invest family capital, just tell me. We will review the prospectus together." Of course, Dad Bradley breathed out, his entire body sagging against the side of his Porsche. "I promise. No more surprises. I will have the documents ready for you to review as soon as the broker finalizes the equity transfer. Monica beamed, squeezing my hand one last time. You are so wonderful, Harrison. Now please come back inside. Drink your tea while it is warm and get some rest. You have earned a quiet day. I promised I would follow them inside after getting some fresh air. I turned slightly away, pretending to admire the manicured landscaping of my estate, allowing them to retreat. As they walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, I watched them very closely. Monica walked with a proud posture of absolute victory. But I saw Bradley reach up to fix his hair. His hands were shaking violently. The seed of absolute suspicion was officially planted in my mind. That evening, the grand dining room of the mansion felt as cold as a mausoleum. I sat at the head of the long oak table picking at a plate of roasted pheasant, maintaining the fragile facade of a weary aging patriarch. Bradley avoided my gaze entirely, focusing intently on his wineglass, his guilt radiating like heat from a furnace. Monica, however, was a picture of radiant, attentive devotion. She carried the conversation gracefully, chatting brightly about a charity gala she was planning for the upcoming winter season. When dinner concluded, we moved slowly to the main living area. Like clockwork, precisely at 8, she appeared from the kitchen carrying a ceramic mug on a silver tray. The familiar pungent scent of damp earth and overripe chamomile drifted through the room, making my stomach clench. Here you go, Harrison, she said, placing the tray gently on the coffee table beside my armchair. Your special tea. Drink it while it is hot. It will help you sleep through the night. I looked at the steaming liquid, then up at her perfectly composed face. For months, I had accepted this evening ritual with profound gratitude, truly believing she genuinely cared for my overall well-being. Now, staring into her bright, unblinking eyes, I saw the absolute void beneath her smile. I picked up the mug with my right hand, allowing a slight manufactured tremor to violently shake the ceramic edge against the matching saucer. Thank you, my dear, I murmured, keeping my voice appropriately weak and raspy. You are always so very thoughtful to an old man. I took a very small, shallow sip, holding the bitter liquid in my mouth, until she turned her back to answer a question from Bradley. Then I quickly swallowed it, fighting a massive urge to grimace. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the padded armrest, playing the part of a man whose energy was entirely depleted by the day. I told them I was retiring to my study for the evening, to read some light material. Monica offered to escort me up the stairs, but I waved her off with a frail gesture, insisting I just needed a quiet, solitary night to rest my bones. I carried the mug down the long carpeted hallway to my private study. I closed the heavy oak door and firmly locked the deadbolt. The silence of the room wrapped around me, but my heart was racing with a dark, terrible anticipation. In the corner of my study, positioned perfectly to catch the morning sunlight, sat a rare imported ficus tree. I had purchased it 5 years ago during a business trip to Southeast Asia. It was a robust, vibrant plant with glossy dark green leaves, a piece of living art that brought warmth to the austere environment of my office. I walked over to the large ceramic pot. The soil was incredibly dry to the touch. I looked down at the steaming mug of herbal tea in my hand. If I was wrong, I was simply pouring a harmless beverage into the dirt. But if my gut feeling was right, I was holding the very instrument of my destruction. I tilted the mug and poured the entire contents into the base of the ficus tree. The dark liquid seeped rapidly into the soil, leaving a faint, acrid smell lingering heavily in the air. I set the empty mug on my polished desk and sat down to wait for the morning light. The next day, my mind felt marginally clearer. The heavy, suffocating fog that usually greeted me upon waking was slightly thinner. When Monica brought the tea that night, I repeated the exact same process. I accepted it with a grateful, trembling smile, carried it to my study, locked the door, and fed it to the ficus tree. I did this on Wednesday. I did this on Thursday. I did this on Friday. The transformation within my own body was nothing short of miraculous. By the third morning, the persistent throbbing ache behind my eyes had completely vanished. The sluggish molasses-like lethargy that bound my limbs evaporated entirely. By the fourth morning, my vision was absolutely sharp, the numbers on my complex financial spreadsheets leaping off the screen with perfect clarity. And my hands. I held them out in front of me, staring at my remarkably steady, unmoving fingers. The violent tremors that had humiliated me in front of my executive board were completely gone. My strength, my intellect, my commanding presence, they all rushed back into my veins with a fierce, undeniable power. I was not suffering from cognitive decline. I was not losing my mind to the cruel ravages of time. I was being systematically and deliberately poisoned in my own home. The physical proof of their treachery sat silently in the corner of my study. On the fifth day, I walked over to inspect the rare ficus tree. The sight of it sent a cold, terrifying shock straight through my chest. The once vibrant, glossy green leaves had turned a sickly, bruised yellow. Dozens of them had withered into curled, blackened husks, dropping to the floor to form a tragic, rotting pile around the base of the ceramic pot. The trunk of the tree felt unnervingly soft and spongy to the touch. The soil itself smelled intensely sour and toxic, completely poisoned by the daily doses of Monica and her special herbal tea. The plant was dying a rapid, agonizing death, absorbing the venom that was originally intended to rot my brain. I stood alone in my study, staring at the dead leaves, feeling a profound, earth-shattering betrayal tear through my soul. The puzzle pieces snapped violently into place, forming a clear picture of absolute horror. The sudden onset of my dementia symptoms, the highly convenient introduction of a new evening routine, the missing $250,000, Bradley and his terrified, sweating face in the driveway, Monica and her smooth, calculated lies. They were not waiting for me to die naturally. They were actively speeding up the process. They needed me incapacitated, confused, and utterly dependent so they could strip me of my power and drain my empire without resistance. The $250,000 was just the beginning. They were testing the waters, checking to see if my induced mental fog was thick enough for them to start siphoning the family wealth. They had turned my sanctuary into a trap, my food into poison, and my unconditional love into a deadly weapon against me. I reached out and crushed one of the blackened leaves between my thumb and forefinger. It crumbled instantly into dry, brittle ash. I wiped the ash from my hand, my jaw set with a rigid, unbreakable determination. I could have marched upstairs right then. I could have thrown the dead branches in their faces, demanded a full confession, and cast them out into the street. The furious, betrayed father inside me wanted to scream until the walls shook. But the corporate titan, the man who built an empire by outsmarting ruthless adversaries, knew far better. Confronting them directly today would only cause sudden disaster. Confronting them directly today would only cause sudden disaster. I needed absolute proof of their ultimate endgame before I dismantled their lives. I spent the remainder of that day carefully maintaining the illusion they had so painstakingly crafted. I shuffled through the grand hallways with a vacant stare. I deliberately dropped a crystal tumbler in the kitchen, apologizing profusely as my hands performed a perfectly orchestrated tremor. Monica was quick to rush to my side, sweeping up the broken glass with a condescending smile, while Bradley watched from the doorway with thinly veiled impatience. I ate my dinner in silence, staring blankly at the wall, playing the role of the broken patriarch, waiting for the end. When Monica brought my evening tea, I accepted it with a grateful nod, brought it to my study, and fed it to the dying roots of the ficus tree. Then I sat in the darkness and waited for the night to deepen. At exactly 2 in the morning, I opened my eyes. The mansion was completely silent, a sprawling cavern of marble and oak, resting under the heavy Chicago sky. For the first time in months, I felt an electric surge of energy coursing through my veins. The lethargy was completely gone. My mind was operating with the sharp, ruthless precision that had built my commercial logistics empire. I quietly pushed the heavy duvet aside and stepped out of bed. I did not bother with slippers. I walked barefoot across the plush carpets, my movements entirely silent. I needed to know what they were doing while they thought I was trapped in a chemically induced stupor. I slipped out of my master suite and moved like a shadow through the long, darkened corridors of the second floor. The moonlight spilled through the tall, arched windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the imported hardwood floors. I approached the grand staircase and descended the curved steps, placing my feet carefully on the edges to avoid any creaking floorboards. As I reached the main foyer, I heard a faint, frantic sound, echoing from the east wing of the estate. It was a voice hushed, but vibrating with intense, desperate energy. I moved cautiously toward the sound, pressing my back against the cold, plastered walls. The noise was coming directly from the conservatory, a glass-enclosed sunroom that overlooked the back gardens. The heavy mahogany double doors were left slightly ajar, allowing a thin sliver of pale yellow light to spill out onto the hallway floor. I crept closer, positioning myself just outside the narrow gap in the doorway. Through the opening, I could clearly see my son. Bradley was pacing frantically back and forth across the heated slate floor. He was not using his usual expensive smartphone. Instead, he had a cheap, bulky plastic burner phone pressed tightly against his ear. His free hand was running wildly through his hair, destroying his usually flawless appearance. He looked completely unhinged, a man pushed to the absolute edge of a very steep cliff. "Listen to me, Bradley," hissed into the receiver, his voice tight, with raw, unfiltered panic. "I told you the transfer hit a snag. The primary accounts are heavily restricted by generational security protocols. I cannot just wire that kind of volume without triggering an immediate federal audit. You have to give me more time." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. Whoever was speaking was clearly not interested in his excuses. Bradley stopped pacing and squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling with fear. "The money will be there," he shouted in a harsh, desperate whisper, leaning over a glass side table. "I just need the old man declared legally incompetent first. The documents are ready. The medical history is perfectly established. We pull the trigger this week. Just hold off your people until Friday. I swear on my life you will have your entire payment." He ripped the phone away from his ear and violently ended the call. He tossed the cheap plastic device onto the cushion of a rattan chair and buried his face in his trembling hands. He let out a long, ragged breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. From the shadows of the adjoining parlor, Monica stepped into the sunroom. She was wearing a silk robe, holding a glass of white wine, looking entirely unfazed by her husband's dramatic breakdown. She walked over to him and casually placed a hand on his hunched shoulder. "Did they buy it?" she asked, taking a slow, relaxed sip of her wine. Bradley looked up, his face pale and glistening with cold sweat. "Barely," he replied, his voice shaking. "They are giving us until the end of the week. If the funds do not clear by then, they said they would stop calling and start visiting. Monica, we are out of time. If he does not sign the authorizations tomorrow, we are completely dead. I cannot force his hand without drawing the attention of the corporate board. They still think he is in charge." Monica let out a soft, highly amused laugh. The sound of her amusement echoed through the glass room, chilling me down to my very core. "Stop panicking like a child, Bradley," she said, her voice dripping with cold, calculated arrogance. "You are worrying over absolutely nothing. Your father's brain is practically turning to mush as we speak. My dosage has been perfectly calibrated. Have you seen him today? He could barely hold his fork at dinner. He did not even know where he was. When we slide those documents in front of him tomorrow morning, he is not going to ask questions. He will not even be capable of reading the header. The dementia is so bad now, he will not even know what he is signing. We just tell him it is a routine insurance update, and he will sign the power of attorney without a second thought." I stood completely frozen in the dark, silent hallway directly outside the sunroom. I listened to my daughter-in-law mock my intelligence while she openly bragged about poisoning my body. I listened to my only son agree with her, entirely willing to strip away my freedom, my dignity, and my life savings just to save himself from a mysterious debt. In that precise, devastating moment, A profound and permanent shift occurred deep within my soul. The warm, forgiving love of a devoted father evaporated completely. It quickly burned away into nothingness, leaving behind a cold, empty, hollow void that was instantly filled with the freezing, ruthless logic of a seasoned corporate predator. They had meticulously planned my demise, laughing at my perceived weakness while they sharpened their knives in the dark. I slowly backed away from the doorway, letting the shadows swallow me once more. I retreated up the grand staircase with absolute silence, returning to the cold safety of my study to prepare for the morning ahead. They desperately wanted a helpless, dying old man to sign away his empire. I would give them exactly the performance they demanded, but I would ensure the ink on that page became their death warrant. The morning sun pierced through the heavy velvet curtains of my bedroom, signaling the start of the most critical day of my life. For the first time in months, my mind was razor sharp. The chemical fog that had clouded my judgment was completely gone, eradicated by the simple act of pouring Monica's toxic tea into the dirt. However, my physical performance had to remain flawless. I spent 20 minutes in front of my bathroom mirror, practicing the vacant, confused stare of a man losing his grip on reality. I let my shoulders slump forward, erasing decades of commanding posture. I practiced a slight rhythmic tremor in my right hand, ensuring it looked as natural and pathetic as it had during the boardroom incident. When I finally shuffled down the grand staircase toward the breakfast room, I was no longer Harrison Caldwell, the corporate titan. I was a frail, helpless old man ready to be led to the slaughter. Bradley and Monica were already waiting for me at the long dining table. The spread was unusually extravagant, featuring freshly baked pastries, imported fruits, and a pot of premium coffee. It was a celebratory feast for a victory they believed was already theirs. Monica sprang up from her chair the moment I entered the room. She rushed to my side, her face twisted into a mask of exaggerated, cloying sympathy. "Harrison, darling, you look so dreadfully tired today," she cooed gently, guiding me by the elbow toward my usual seat at the head of the table. "Did you not sleep well?" I let my head loll slightly to the side, blinking slowly, as if trying to process her simple question. "I am just a bit fatigued, my dear," I mumbled, slurring my words just enough to sound concerning. "The nights seem so long lately." Bradley cleared his throat. He was sitting with his back unnaturally straight, staring intently at a thick manila folder resting next to his coffee cup. He was trying to project the image of a responsible son taking charge, but I could see the frantic pulse beating wildly in his neck. "Dad, we have some administrative housekeeping to take care of this morning," he said, his voice carrying a forced, hearty cheerfulness. "Just some routine insurance updates and facility management forms." I reached out for a piece of toast, allowing my hand to shake violently, nearly knocking over my crystal water glass in the process. Monica gasped softly, quickly steadying the glass with her own hand. "Oh, Harrison, let me help you with that," she murmured, buttering the toast for me like I was a helpless toddler. Bradley pushed the manila folder across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of my plate. "The corporate lawyers sent these over last night," he explained, tapping the top of the folder with a manicured finger. "It is mostly boring compliance paperwork for the new logistics centers. Health and safety declarations, environmental waivers, that sort of thing. I just need your signature on a few key pages so we can file them before the end of the quarter." I slowly pulled the folder toward me, dragging my fingers clumsily over the cardboard. I opened the cover. The first few pages were exactly what he claimed, standard corporate drivel meant to bore the reader into submission. But my sharp, unclouded eyes immediately caught the dense, heavily formatted legal text of the fourth document. It was a comprehensive, absolute, durable power of attorney. It was drafted to grant Bradley total and irrevocable control over my personal finances, my corporate voting rights, my real estate holdings, and my medical decisions. It was a blank check to steal my entire life. I let out a long, confused sigh, rubbing my temples as if a massive headache was forming. "This is so much text, Bradley," I whispered, letting a note of genuine panic bleed into my voice. "I cannot focus on these small letters today." My eyes are simply not working properly. Do I really need to read all of this right now? Bradley leaned forward, the predatory hunger in his eyes completely unmistakable. No, Dad. You do not need to read it at all, he assured me smoothly. It is just bureaucratic red tape. I have already reviewed every single line with the legal team. All you need to do is sign at the bottom where the yellow sticky notes are, and I will handle all the tedious filing for you. You can just go back to bed and rest. Monica magically produced a heavy gold fountain pen from her pocket, uncapping it and pressing it gently into my right hand. I gripped the pen loosely. I let my hand hover over the thick, creamy paper of the power of attorney document, allowing a massive, uncontrollable tremor to shake the gold barrel. I looked up at them with wide, frightened eyes, playing the ultimate victim. Thank you for taking care of this son, I slurred. I do not know what I would do without you both. I lowered the pen to the paper. I did not sign my legal name. For 30 years, every binding corporate contract I signed required my full legal name, Harrison Arthur Caldwell, with a very specific unbroken loop connecting the middle initial to the last name. It was a security measure I established decades ago. Instead, I pressed the nib into the paper and scrawled a shaky, jagged version of just Harrison Caldwell, deliberately breaking the cursive loop and omitting my middle name entirely. It was a legally invalid signature, completely worthless in any court of law or financial institution. I repeated this fraudulent scribble across all the marked pages, ensuring each signature looked like the desperate failing effort of a man whose brain was rotting away. When I finished the final page, I let the gold fountain pen slip from my weakened grip. It clattered noisily onto the polished mahogany table, rolling to a stop against my coffee cup. I slumped back into my large dining chair, letting out a loud, exaggerated groan of pure exhaustion. I closed my eyes, completely shutting them out, acting as though the simple mental task of writing my own name had completely drained whatever small reserve of energy I possessed. The silence in the dining room was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crisp rustle of thick paper as Bradley swiftly gathered the documents. I peeked through my half-closed eyelids, watching them through the blur of my eyelashes. The transformation in their demeanor was absolutely instantaneous and profoundly chilling. Bradley snatched the manila folder, clutching it tightly against his chest like a prized trophy. He looked directly across the long dining room table at Monica. A huge, victorious grin spread across his face, completely erasing the nervous, terrified boy from the previous morning. Monica smiled right back, her eyes gleaming with dark, predatory satisfaction. They genuinely believed they had successfully stolen my entire commercial real estate empire. They truly believed they owned my life. They left me sitting alone at the table, walking away with their worthless prize, completely unaware that their total destruction was already in full motion. I waited exactly 2 hours after they left the dining room to make my next move. I found Bradley and Monica in the main living room, huddled over a laptop, no doubt already plotting how to liquidate my assets. As I shuffled into the room, leaning heavily on a walking cane I had retrieved from the hall closet, they hastily slammed the laptop shut. I offered them a weak, trembling smile. I told them how deeply grateful I was for their tireless dedication to the family business and to my health. I explained that I wanted to reward them for carrying such a heavy burden during my recent decline. I pulled a sleek silver envelope from my cardigan pocket and handed it to Monica. Inside were 2 first-class tickets to Aspen, Colorado, along with a confirmed reservation for the penthouse suite at a 5-star ski resort, all expenses paid for the entire weekend. Monica let out a sharp gasp of delight, her eyes sparkling with unadulterated greed. Bradley looked at the tickets, then at me, feigning concern. He asked if I would be all right alone for the weekend. I waved him off with a dismissive, trembling hand, insisting that the house staff would attend to my every need and that they desperately deserved a romantic getaway. The sheer velocity of their departure was almost comical. Within 3 hours, they had packed their designer luggage and were sitting in the back of my chauffeured Maybach, heading straight for the international airport. I stood by the large bay window in the front parlor, watching the sleek black car roll down the long driveway, and disappear through the wrought iron gates. The moment the taillights vanished from sight, I dropped the wooden cane onto the floor. I straightened my back, rolling my shoulders to release the tension of playing a crippled old man. I walked over to the landline on the mahogany console, picked up the receiver, and dialed a number I knew by heart. "Thomas." I said, my voice crisp and commanding, completely devoid of the pathetic slur I had maintained all morning. "They are in the air. Bring the team in." 45 minutes later, a plain white commercial van pulled through the front gates, followed closely by a sleek, black utility vehicle. Thomas Bennett. My chief corporate counsel stepped out of the vehicle. Thomas was a brilliant, ruthless man who treated corporate litigation like a blood sport. He had been by my side for 2 decades, protecting my empire from every conceivable threat. He did not ask questions. He simply executed orders with lethal efficiency. Behind him emerged a team of 6 men dressed in dark, unassuming clothing, carrying heavy aluminum equipment cases. They were not corporate auditors. They were a highly specialized, elite private cybersecurity firm composed of former military intelligence operatives. I had retained them on a contract that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. I met them in the grand foyer. "We have exactly 48 hours before they return." I told the lead technician, a stoic man named Vance, "I want this entire estate swept. I want every smart device, every security camera, and every network router completely bypassed and mirrored. They think they are monitoring me. I want total control over what they see, and I want absolute access to everything they are hiding." Vance nodded silently and signaled his team. They moved through my home with terrifying surgical precision. Within the first hour, they discovered exactly how deeply my privacy had been violated. Monica had meticulously compromised the integrated smart home network. Vance showed me the hidden microcameras she had seamlessly installed inside the crown molding of my study and the master bedroom. She had been recording my every move, specifically capturing the moments when the poisoned tea induced my simulated dementia. She was gathering a curated video portfolio to present to a judge to definitively prove my mental incompetence. "Disable the live feeds, but loop the archival footage," I ordered. "Let her watch a continuous recording of me sleeping in my chair. Keep her pacified while she enjoys her first-class flight." While the technicians systematically dismantled the digital surveillance, Thomas and I went upstairs to the East Wing, walking directly into the master suite Monica and Bradley occupied. I knew my daughter-in-law was exceptionally cunning, but she was also incredibly vain. She trusted the physical security of her own space over external digital clouds. I instructed Thomas to focus his search on the custom-built walk-in closet. We meticulously sifted through rows of designer shoes and expensive handbags. It took 20 minutes before my hand brushed against a false panel behind a row of cedar shoe racks. I pressed firmly against the polished wood, and the panel clicked open, revealing a heavy biometric steel safe bolted directly into the structural framing of the house. I called Vance up to the room. I pointed to the glowing digital keypad on the front of the safe. "Open it," I commanded. Vance did not reach for a crowbar or a drill. He opened a small metallic case and produced a complex sequence of electronic bypass cables and a digital decryptor. He attached the nodes to the exposed circuitry of the keypad. For 12 tense minutes, the only sound in the massive closet was the rapid rhythmic clicking of his decryptor running thousands of numerical permutations. Finally, a sharp green light flashed on the safe display. The heavy steel bolts retracted with a deep, satisfying thud. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside rested a stack of velvet jewelry boxes, several bundles of foreign currency, and most importantly, a solid-state external hard drive wrapped in a protective anti-static sleeve. I carefully reached in and pulled the drive out, handing it directly to Vance. "This is the Holy Grail," I said, feeling the weight of the moment. "Clone every single byte of data on this drive. I want a complete unencrypted mirror of everything she has been hiding, and I want no digital footprint left behind to indicate this drive was ever accessed." Vance connected the drive to a heavily modified military-grade laptop. The progress bar on the screen began to crawl forward. We stood in the center of the closet, watching the percentage climb, the silence stretching tightly across the room. Thomas stood by the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute focus. This was no longer a simple family dispute over a stolen $250,000. We were invading a heavily fortified digital vault, uncovering the secrets of a woman who had poisoned my food, and a son who had planned my absolute ruin. The cloning process took 42 minutes. When the laptop finally signaled completion, Vance safely unmounted the original drive, placed it back into the anti-static sleeve, and returned it to the exact position inside the steel safe. He closed the heavy door, locking it, and resetting the biometric scanner to erase any trace of our intrusion. He handed me a small encrypted USB drive containing the cloned data. I took the small encrypted drive from Vance, feeling the cold metal press firmly against my palm. It was remarkably light for an object that held the power to destroy 2 lives. We moved immediately downstairs to the grand dining room, the very same table where I had played the trembling fool just hours before. Thomas unpacked a thick black briefcase, extracting a specialized hardened laptop. He plugged the cloned drive into the machine, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced lethal speed. Vance and his team retreated to the perimeter, maintaining a silent vigil over the mansion, while my attorney went to war. The initial layer of data was exactly what we expected. Monica had meticulously organized a terrifying portfolio of video files, medical journals, and toxicological research. There were dozens of high-definition clips showing me staring blankly at the television, dropping glasses, and slurring my speech. She had even kept a digital ledger of the exact chemical measurements she was slipping into my herbal tea, adjusting the poison day by day to perfectly mimic advanced cognitive decay. It was deeply disturbing to watch my own manufactured decline play out on the high-resolution screen. But it was merely the superficial layer of their deception. Thomas was not satisfied. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he noticed a massive discrepancy in the storage volume. "There is a ghost partition here," Thomas murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. "She tried to bury it beneath the medical files, but the file architecture is bleeding over. Give me 3 minutes." He ran a brute force decryption protocol, his screen flooding with cascading lines of green code. When the firewall finally shattered, a hidden directory materialized. It was not Monica's personal files. It was a mirrored backup of Bradley's private offshore communications and heavily encrypted financial ledgers. My daughter-in-law, ever the calculating predator, had been quietly keeping leverage on her own husband. Thomas began cross-referencing the ledgers with the main servers of my logistics empire, tapping into our corporate mainframes to trace the digital footprints Bradley thought he had erased. As the forensic audit unfolded across the screen, the atmosphere in the dining room grew incredibly heavy. The bombshell dropped with devastating, absolute clarity. The story about the luxury assisted living franchise was a complete fabrication. The $250,000 that had vanished from the generational trust was not a down payment, and it was certainly not an investment. It was a penalty fee, a blood tax paid for a monumental, catastrophic failure. I stared at the banking nodes linking my son to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and shell companies operating out of Central America. Thomas brought up a series of internal manifests from Caldwell Logistics, specifically targeting our secondary Midwestern trucking fleets. These were older, less scrutinized supply lines that handled bulk agricultural transport across state borders. According to the encrypted logs, Bradley had secretly bypassed the primary executive oversight protocols. He had created a shadow dispatch system entirely isolating 3 specific transport trucks from the main tracking grid. He was not moving agricultural supplies. My son, the supposed heir to a legitimate commercial empire, had been leasing my trucks to an international money laundering syndicate. He was using the Caldwell name and our pristine corporate reputation as a bulletproof shield to transport massive pallets of illicit cartel cash across the country. My breathing slowed as the sheer magnitude of his stupidity washed over me. Bradley was not a criminal mastermind. He was a weak, entitled boy, playing a dangerous game with men who butchered people for sport. The ledgers revealed the exact nature of his fatal error. 3 weeks ago, one of the shadow trucks deviated from its designated route. Whether the driver panicked or a rival syndicate intervened, the documentation did not say. But the result was explicitly clear. A shipment containing several $1 million in untraceable cartel cash had completely vanished. The syndicate did not care about excuses, and they certainly did not care about Bradley's pedigree. The $250,000 was simply a late fee, a desperate bleeding payment meant to buy him a few extra days of breathing room. The final piece of the puzzle lay buried in a folder containing intercepted text messages and burner phone audio transcripts that Monica had secretly archived. Thomas clicked on the most recent file, a terrifyingly brief communication dated just 2 days ago. The voice that crackled through the laptop speakers was distorted, calm, and terrifyingly polite. It was the voice of a man who dealt in absolute certainties. "We appreciate the interest payment, Bradley." The voice purred, sending a chill down my spine. "But patience is a luxury we no longer afford. The principal balance remains outstanding. You have until Friday at midnight to execute a clean, untraceable wire transfer of $5 million to the designated accounts. If the funds do not clear, we will no longer consider this a financial transaction. We will consider it a blood debt, and we will collect it directly from you." The audio file ended with a sharp click, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The puzzle was completely solved, the terrifying picture finally clear. This was the reason for their frantic, sloppy desperation. This was why Monica had accelerated the poisoning, risking detection, to turn my brain into mush. They did not just want my money to fund their lavish lifestyle. They were entirely out of time, backed into a corner by ruthless killers. Bradley needed $5 million of liquid capital to save his life, and the only way to bypass the heavily fortified security protocols of my primary accounts was to hold an absolute, durable power of attorney. He needed me legally incapacitated, so he could drain the corporate treasury without triggering an executive board lockdown. He was willing to poison his father, destroy the legacy I spent 40 years building, and hand my empire to an international crime syndicate, all to cover his own pathetic incompetence. I sat back in the heavy chair, looking at the glowing laptop screen. The anger I felt was no longer hot or explosive. It had refined into cold, absolute stillness. My son had invited predators to my door. He had jeopardized the lives of my employees, the safety of my company, and the security of everything I had sworn to protect. He was a liability, a spreading infection that needed to be surgically removed before it destroyed the host. Thomas closed the laptop, turning his dark, serious eyes toward me. "What are your orders, Harrison?" he asked quietly. I stood up, feeling the unbroken strength returning to my body. I walked over to the dining room window, looking out over the manicured lawns of my estate. The time for playing the weak victim was officially over. I turned back to Thomas, my voice echoing with ruthless authority. "Let them enjoy the slopes in Aspen," I replied. "When they finally return, they will find all the locks changed, the accounts completely frozen, and the entire world they thought they owned permanently erased." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression hardening into a mask of pure resolve. He simply reached out, disconnected the encrypted drive from the primary terminal, and began to pack away his digital forensic equipment. Vance and his team of operatives moved swiftly through the dining room, erasing any physical trace of our late-night intrusion. Within 10 minutes, they had vanished into the morning darkness, leaving Thomas and me alone in the sprawling, quiet mansion. The heavy mahogany clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, an echoing sound that perfectly matched the coldness taking root in my chest. I sat back down at the long dining table, pulling my personal laptop toward me. Thomas handed me the secondary clone drive. We were not finished. The audio transcript had provided the motive, but I needed to understand the terrifying mechanics of the ultimate endgame my son had designed. I inserted the drive and opened the primary directory. I bypassed the folders containing the pathetic video surveillance Monica had gathered and navigated directly into the secured communication logs Thomas had decrypted earlier. These were raw, unedited email chains routed through anonymous offshore servers. Bradley had been communicating with his cartel handlers for over 6 months, leaving a digital trail of pure, staggering incompetence. I began reading the earliest exchanges. Initially, the tone was professional. Bradley had offered them an incredibly efficient method for moving vast sums of untraceable currency across the American Midwest using my secondary logistics fleets. They paid him a handsome percentage for the service. It was a lucrative, highly illegal arrangement that fueled his sudden wealth. He bought designer cars, lavish vacations, and custom jewelry, all financed by blood money, while he smiled warmly at my dinner table. But as I scrolled down to the communications from the past 3 weeks, the tone violently shifted. The polite language completely vanished. It was replaced by short, brutal, and terrifyingly explicit directives. A massive shipment had disappeared somewhere near the Canadian border. The syndicate did not ask for explanations, and they did not care about logistical errors. They simply demanded restitution. I opened an email marked with high-priority flags dated exactly 5 days ago. The text was brief and chillingly precise. "The grace period has officially expired." The message read, "Your excuses are no longer acceptable. You will provide a clean, untraceable wire transfer of $5 million to the designated accounts by this Thursday at exactly 3 in the morning. If the funds do not clear the final routing node by that minute, we will dispatch a retrieval team to your primary residence. You will pay us with your life. There will be no further warnings. Thursday at 3 in the morning." I stared at the digital timestamp, my mind racing through the timeline. Today was Tuesday. Bradley and Monica were currently flying first class to Aspen, a trip I had funded to get them out of the house. They planned to return late Wednesday evening, armed with the fraudulently signed power of attorney, ready to execute the massive wire transfer mere hours before the cartel deadline. It was a desperate, razor-thin margin of error. But the $5 million was only a fraction of my total liquid assets. Bradley was a coward, but Monica was a greedy, calculating predator. I knew they would not stop at simply paying off the syndicate. I dug deeper into the hidden partition, searching for the personal correspondence Monica had kept hidden. I needed to know exactly what they planned to do with me once the family treasury was completely unlocked. I found a nested folder labeled simply as long-term care. It contained a series of highly confidential encrypted emails between Monica and a private medical liaison. I opened the first document, my blood turning to absolute ice as my eyes scanned the paragraphs. The facility she had chosen for me was not an ultra-premium assisted living center in the Gold Coast. It was a private, heavily secured psychiatric institution located in a remote, isolated county 300 miles away. The correspondence detailed a highly specific, terrifyingly permanent arrangement. Monica had forwarded my falsified medical records, complete with the video footage of my chemically induced dementia, to a corrupt administrative director. She had already paid a massive deposit to secure a permanent room in their locked memory care ward. The plan laid out in the emails was a masterpiece of pure evil. On Thursday morning, after draining my accounts to pay the cartel and transferring the remaining millions into their own private offshore trusts, they were going to have me involuntarily committed. The power of attorney I had signed gave Bradley the absolute legal authority to make all my medical decisions. The documents explicitly requested that I be kept heavily sedated at all times, citing a fabricated history of violent, unpredictable outbursts. I would be locked in a sterile, windowless room pumped full of heavy tranquilizers and completely stripped of any ability to communicate. I would be a penniless, drugged prisoner trapped in a nightmare where no one would ever listen to my complaints. They were going to steal my entire legacy, save themselves from the cartel, and bury me alive in a chemical tomb where I would slowly rot away until I died. I sat in the silent dining room reading the clinical detached descriptions of the medications they planned to force down my throat. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal defied all human comprehension. This was not a simple case of corporate theft or greedy children wanting their inheritance early. This was premeditated, cold-blooded psychological murder. My own son, the boy I had raised, educated, and welcomed into my company, was perfectly willing to hand me over to a living death just to cover his own pathetic mistakes. My daughter-in-law, the woman who smiled sweetly while pouring poison into my evening tea, had meticulously engineered my total destruction. They truly believed I was a foolish, declining old man, completely oblivious to the trap closing around my throat. I slowly closed the laptop, the soft click echoing sharply in the large room. The paternal love, the desire to protect, the instinct to forgive, every single vestige of paternal weakness was permanently burned out of my soul. I was entirely free from the burden of family loyalty. I stood up slowly, feeling a sudden surge of immense, terrible power rising in my chest. The game was no longer about simply stopping a fraudulent financial transfer or teaching an ungrateful son a lesson. It was a fight for my literal survival, a war for my freedom, my mind, and my legacy. Bradley and Monica had constructed a perfect trap, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the prey they were hunting. I walked slowly toward the tall glass windows, looking out into the cold, dark grounds of my sweeping estate. The ruthless international cartel wanted their money by Thursday at exactly 3 a.m. Bradley needed my legal authority to save his life. Monica wanted my massive fortune and my permanent silence. I was now fully prepared to give them both a masterclass in absolute, total, and uncompromising destruction. I stepped away from the glass, leaving the cold beauty of my estate behind. Thomas was waiting by the mahogany door, holding the encrypted drive like a live explosive. We did not waste a single moment. I knew standard law enforcement would be entirely useless here. A call to the local police would trigger a massive, uncontrolled panic. Bradley would be arrested for forgery. Monica would hire defense attorneys, and the cartel would slip back into the shadows, retaliating against my companies for the exposure. I needed a completely different caliber of justice. I needed the federal government, and I needed someone who operated with the same ruthless efficiency that I did. Thomas made the arrangements using a secure, untraceable satellite connection. Within 2 hours, my SUV was gliding through the rain-slicked streets of downtown Chicago, heading far away from the affluent glow of the Gold Coast. We descended into the subterranean depths of a municipal parking garage beneath the financial district. The air was thick with the scent of motor oil and damp concrete. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sickly shadows across the rows of empty vehicles. We drove to the lowest sublevel, a restricted zone reserved for high-clearance government vehicles. A lone, unmarked sedan was idling in the corner, its headlights cutting sharply through the gloom. As we pulled up, the metal door swung open, and a man stepped out into the harsh fluorescent glare. This was Special Agent Victor Mitchell of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with closely cropped gray hair and eyes that looked like cracked flint. He wore no formal suit. He wore a dark tactical jacket and dark slacks, moving with the quiet, heavy grace of a man accustomed to violence. Mitchell was a legend within the organized crime division, a veteran operative who had spent his entire career dismantling international syndicates. Thomas had known him for years, trading high-level corporate intelligence for federal favors. Mitchell approached my window as I rolled it down. The cold subterranean air rushed into the heated cabin. He leaned down, resting his forearms on the doorframe, surveying me with a flat, highly skeptical expression. "Harrison Caldwell," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that echoed off the concrete walls. "Thomas tells me you have a situation that requires a very delicate, very heavy hand. I hear you have a cartel problem in your living room." I did not blink, nor did I look away. I simply handed him the heavily encrypted USB drive. "I do not have a problem, Agent Mitchell," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I have a highly lucrative opportunity for you. On that drive is a complete forensic mirror of a hidden offshore communications server. It contains names, dates, routing numbers, and exact logistical manifests, detailing how a major international syndicate has been moving millions of dollars across the Midwestern United States. Mitchell took the small drive, weighing it in his palm, his flinty eyes narrowing. And how exactly did a commercial real estate and logistics magnate acquire this level of organized crime intelligence? Because the idiot running the local operation is my son, I stated coldly. I watched the sudden flash of surprise register on the veteran agent's face before he quickly suppressed it. I explained the entire situation, laying out the miserable, cowardly reality of Bradley's betrayal. I detailed the shadow dispatch system he had created within my secondary trucking fleets, the lost shipment of illicit cash, and the terrifying ultimatum the cartel had issued. I told him about the poisoned tea, the fraudulent power of attorney, and the horrific plan to lock me away in a remote psychiatric ward while they drained my empire to save their own skins. They owe the syndicate $5 million by Thursday at 3 a.m. I concluded, letting the absolute gravity of the deadline hang in the damp air. If they do not pay, they are dead. If they do pay, the money vanishes into a black hole of offshore ghost accounts, and the cartel continues to operate with total impunity. Mitchell leaned back slightly, slipping the drive into his jacket pocket. This is incredibly actionable intelligence, Caldwell. We can raid your son's house right now, freeze the accounts, and put him in federal custody before he even lands back from Aspen. I shook my head sharply, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. No, I said firmly. If you arrest Bradley now, the cartel cuts their losses and burns the financial bridges. You get the foot soldiers, but you lose the entire financial network. I am not offering you a simple local arrest. I am offering you the entire offshore syndicate. I leaned closer to the window, locking my gaze onto his. Here is the deal, Agent Mitchell. I will act as live bait. I will let Bradley and Monica believe their plan is working perfectly. Tomorrow night, when they attempt to execute the transfer, I will allow them to initiate the sequence. They will input the cartel's hidden routing numbers into my corporate banking terminal. In that exact moment, the ghost accounts will be forced out into the open, actively receiving the digital handshake from my servers. Your division will monitor the transaction in real time. You will trace the routing numbers to their primary offshore hubs, map the entire financial network, and intercept the $5 million before it clears the final international node. You get the definitive proof you need to dismantle their entire laundering operation. Mitchell stared at me, calculating the massive risks and the unprecedented rewards. That is an incredibly dangerous play, he warned quietly. If my team misses the interception window by even a fraction of a second, you lose $5 million of your own money permanently. I am perfectly willing to risk $5 million to see this through to the end, I countered smoothly. In exchange for handing you the largest organized crime bust of your career, I demand ironclad terms. First, my logistics empire remains entirely insulated from any public fallout. My companies are categorized as victims of fraud, not accomplices. Second, I want federal RICO charges brought against my son and my daughter-in-law. I want them charged with conspiracy, wire fraud, attempted murder, and racketeering. I want them locked in a federal penitentiary for decades, with absolutely no possibility of parole. Mitchell stood in silence, the harsh lights buzzing above us, weighing the sheer brutality. Father, condemning his own blood. Finally, a slow, grim smile touched the corners of his mouth. You are a remarkably cold man, Mr. Caldwell, he said, extending his right hand. I reached through the window and grasped his hand firmly, sealing the destruction of my family. We have a deal, the agent confirmed. My team will be watching your servers tomorrow night. Do not miss your cue. We drove out of the dark garage, heading back to the mansion to wait for the final act. The trap was set, the hunters were positioned, and the prey was happily flying home, completely oblivious to the massacre waiting for them. The drive back from the subterranean garage was wrapped in a thick, heavy silence. The rain had intensified, drumming a steady rhythmic beat against the tinted windows of the SUV. I leaned my head against the cool leather headrest, feeling a profound sense of finality settling over my mind. The pieces were no longer just moving on the board. They were locked into their inevitable, fatal positions. Thomas dropped me off at the grand entrance of my estate, offering a single solemn nod before the vehicle glided away into the dark, wet night. I stepped inside the grand echoing foyer. The mansion was empty, vast, and waiting. I spent the daylight hours of Wednesday preparing my sanctuary. My private study, already a formidable space, was quietly transformed into a secure command center. Vance had left behind a secure encrypted terminal directly linked to Mitchell and the federal task force. I tested the heavy deadbolts on the solid oak doors and ensured the reinforced glass windows were securely locked. Everything had to be absolutely flawless. At 6 p.m, the heavy front doors swung open, breaking the immense silence of the estate. Bradley and Monica had finally returned safely home. They had returned from their all-expenses-paid luxury retreat in Aspen. I remained seated in my leather armchair in the main living room, draped in a thick wool blanket, staring blankly at the unlit fireplace. The moment they spotted me, the sickeningly sweet performance began. They swept into the room, bringing the brisk chill of the winter air with them. Monica rushed to my side, her face glowing with a fresh, expensive spa tan, her smile so wide and manufactured it looked almost painful. "Harrison, darling," she cooed, leaning down to press a cold, performative kiss against my cheek. "We missed you terribly," she continued, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Aspen was absolutely gorgeous, but we simply could not stop worrying about you. We felt so guilty leaving you all alone in this massive house." I turned my head slowly, letting my eyes drift out of focus, blinking, as if trying to recognize the woman standing in front of me. "I am glad you had a wonderful time, my dear," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail and raspy. "The house was very quiet without you. I mostly just rested quietly." Bradley stepped forward, shedding his designer cashmere overcoat. He tossed it casually over a silk sofa. He looked vibrant, bursting with a toxic, manic energy. The crushing panic I had witnessed in the sunroom just days ago was completely gone, replaced by a reckless, arrogant swagger. He believed his trap was flawlessly executed. He thought the fraudulent signature on that legal document was his golden ticket to salvation. "Dad, you look exhausted," he said, adopting a tone of deep patronizing concern. "Have you been eating properly? The staff said you barely touched your meals while we were away. You really need to keep your strength up right now." "I just do not have much of an appetite lately, son," I slurred gently, letting my right hand tremble against the wool blanket. "Everything just tastes a bit like dust." Monica immediately clapped her hands together, a sharp ringing sound that echoed in the large room. "Well, we are going to fix that right now," she announced brightly. "I will go into the kitchen and prepare a nice warm bowl of soup for you. And of course, your special evening tea. We need to get you back on your routine, Harrison. Routine is so incredibly important for your condition today." She spun around and marched toward the kitchen, her heels clicking victoriously against the hardwood floor. Bradley sat down in the armchair opposite mine, crossing his legs and resting his ankle on his knee. He watched me with a predatory, assessing gaze like a vulture circling a dying animal. He was looking for any sign of resistance, any spark of clarity that might threaten his midnight deadline. I gave him nothing. I simply stared down at my trembling hands, playing the defeated, broken shell of a father he so desperately needed me to be. 20 minutes later, Monica returned smiling. She was carrying the familiar silver tray. She set it down on the low coffee table between us. The bowl of soup sat untouched, but the ceramic mug of dark, steaming liquid demanded my immediate attention. The pungent, bitter aroma of the poisoned tea filled the space between us. "Drink up, darling," she urged, her eyes gleaming with dark intent. "It will help you sleep deeply tonight." I reached out with both hands, allowing them to shake so violently that the dark liquid sloshed against the sides of the ceramic mug. I brought it up to my waiting lips carefully. I did not swallow a single drop. I pressed the rim against my mouth, faking a slow, labored gulp, letting a small amount of the bitter liquid spill down my chin to sell the illusion. I lowered the mug, offering her a weak, grateful nod. I waited until Monica turned her attention to her phone, then I subtly tipped the mug, pouring the contents directly into the thick, highly absorbent soil of a large decorative fern sitting beside my chair. The soil drank the poison instantly, leaving no trace of my deception. I placed the empty mug back down softly. Monica looked up and smiled a terrifying expression of complete satisfaction. "Good boy," she whispered, the condescension practically dripping from her words. Bradley leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together. He looked at the empty mug, then up at my face. "Dad, since we are all sitting here together, there is something we need to discuss," he said, his voice entirely too casual. "It is about the business and about your worsening condition. The doctors have been very clear that stress is accelerating your decline. We cannot have you worrying about corporate finances anymore now. It is just not safe for your health." I blinked slowly, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. "What do you mean, Bradley?" I mumbled, forcing my eyes to look glassy and confused. "Tomorrow morning I am officially taking over the primary financial authorizations for the family trust and the corporate treasury," he announced, his tone utterly final. "You signed the paperwork before we left, remember? The power of attorney. It is just a formality, really. It will allow me to handle the heavy lifting, pay the bill, manage the investments, and ensure your legacy is perfectly protected from harm today. You will not have to lift a finger or worry again. I will take care of absolutely everything." I looked at my son, staring into the eyes of the man preparing to bury me. I simply offered him a vacant, empty smile. "That sounds wonderful, son," I whispered. "I trust you." Bradley exhaled a sharp, heavy breath, visibly relaxing. "Thank you, Dad," he said. "You should head to bed now." I stood leaning on my wooden cane. I wished them good night, shuffled down the dark hallway, stepped inside my fortified study, and securely locked the heavy steel deadbolts tight. The moment the heavy steel deadbolts clicked into place, the facade of the frail old man vanished entirely. I dropped the wooden cane onto the plush carpet and straightened my back, rolling the stiff tension from my shoulders. The study was bathed in the cool blue glow of several high-definition monitors that Vance and his cybersecurity team had installed earlier that day. Sitting quietly in the corner illuminated by the screens was Special Agent Victor Mitchell. He wore the same dark tactical jacket, his eyes fixed intently on the glowing data streams cascading across the central monitor. A pair of federal tech analysts sat beside him, their fingers hovering over specialized keyboards, completely silent and perfectly prepared. The trap was fully armed, and we were simply waiting for the rat to step onto the trigger. I walked over to the leather chair positioned directly in the center of the command station and sat down. My personal laptop was seamlessly integrated into the federal network, giving me absolute control over my corporate mainframe. Mitchell offered a curt acknowledging nod, but remained entirely silent. The digital clock on the primary screen displayed midnight. We had 2 full hours before the cartel deadline. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic hum of the computer cooling fans and the occasional tap of a keyboard. I poured a small glass of sparkling water, sipping slowly, letting the cold liquid wash away the lingering, bitter phantom taste of Monica and her poisoned tea. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, visualizing the empire I had built from nothing, the thousands of employees who relied on my steady hand, and the sheer audacity of the son who thought he could steal it all in a single night. As the digital clock relentlessly ticked toward the 2 o'clock hour, the atmosphere in the study grew incredibly tense. The federal analysts leaned closer to their screens, their posture rigid with anticipation. Mitchell stood up, crossing his thick arms over his chest, his gaze locked onto the network firewall interface. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, a sharp, piercing chime echoed from the central monitor. A small red alert box flashed across the screen, signaling an authorized access attempt on the primary corporate treasury portal. Bradley was awake, and he was making his move, We have a live connection, one of the tech analysts murmured, his voice a low, steady whisper. The IP address is bouncing through a local proxy, but it originates from the master bedroom upstairs. He is using a secured tablet. I watched the screen with cold, detached fascination. Bradley was moving with frantic speed. The system logs showed him bypassing the standard two-factor authentication, utilizing the executive backdoor access he had secretly established weeks ago. A new window popped up on our monitor, displaying a high-resolution scan of the absolute durable power of attorney. He was uploading the fraudulent document to the bank automated compliance system, using my jagged invalid signature to override the massive withdrawal limits. The digital gears turned smoothly, blindly accepting the paperwork. The bank automated protocols designed for efficiency rather than deep forensic scrutiny recognized his executive clearance and granted him the keys to the kingdom. "He is in," Mitchell stated, his voice a gravelly rasp. "He has full access to the primary liquid capital reserves. Get ready to trace the routing nodes." On the screen, the transaction window opened. Bradley did not hesitate. He immediately initiated a wire transfer for exactly $5 million. I watched as he painstakingly entered the complex, multi-layered offshore routing numbers the cartel had provided. This was the exact information Mitchell needed. The moment Bradley hit the enter key, the numbers were captured by the federal software, instantly decoded, and sent to the FBI Cyber Division for real-time tracing. The ghost accounts were suddenly pulled from the shadows into the glaring light of federal scrutiny. "The transfer is pending," the analyst reported, his fingers flying across the keys. "It is entering the final processing stage. It has to pass through 3 international clearinghouses before it hits the cartel drop account." This was the critical moment. If the transfer fully cleared, my money was gone and Bradley would successfully pay his blood debt. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the keyboard of my personal laptop. I did not build a multi-billion-dollar international logistics corporation without installing a few invisible safety nets. When I originally designed the corporate mainframe architecture 3 decades ago, I coded a master sequence known only to me. It was a failsafe, a digital kill switch designed to instantly freeze the entire empire in the event of a catastrophic hostile takeover. I called it the Founder Override. I watched the progress bar on the screen fill with green light, indicating the transfer was seconds away from irreversible completion. I began to type. I entered a sequence of 42 alphanumeric characters, a complex cryptographic key that bypassed every single layer of modern security software. The system recognized its creator immediately. A prompt appeared, flashing in bright, blinding white text, demanding the final execution command. "Shut him down," Mitchell ordered, his eyes never leaving the screen. I hit the enter key with a heavy, definitive strike. The response was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. Across the network, every single corporate server locked down simultaneously. The progress bar for the $5 million wire transfer froze completely, halting just millimeters before completion. Down the hall in the master bedroom, Bradley and his screen would have instantly gone black, replaced by a glaring red error message indicating a critical, catastrophic system failure. He was completely, permanently, and irrevocably locked out of the company he thought he owned. His administrative credentials were vaporized, his access codes deleted, and his digital footprint erased from the corporate directory. "He is locked out," the analyst confirmed, a hint of genuine awe in his voice. "The execution protocol completely severed his connection. The funds are suspended in the outgoing queue." "Reroute them," I commanded, my voice echoing with pure, unfiltered authority. I initiated the second phase of the override protocol. I seized the suspended $5 million, effectively pulling the massive sum of money back from the edge of the international ether. But I did not return it to my corporate treasury. Instead, I engaged the trap I had carefully coordinated with Mitchell. I manually altered the destination parameters. I replaced the cartel offshore drop account with the secured, heavily monitored receiving servers operated directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The green progress bar surged forward, completing the transaction in a fraction of a second. The $5 million vanished from the corporate ledger, completely bypassing the international clearinghouses and dropping safely into federal custody. The screen flashed a bright green confirmation notice. The money was secured. The trap had slammed shut with absolute force. "We finally have it all," Mitchell said, a grim, highly satisfied smile spreading across his face. "The funds are secured in our federal accounts, and the cartel offshore routing network is completely exposed to us right now." He nodded. The bright green confirmation notice remained burned onto the center monitor, a digital monument to my son's absolute ruin. Special Agent Mitchell stepped back from the console, uncrossing his heavy arms. He spoke quietly into a secure headset, receiving swift verification from the Federal Cyber Division in Washington. The $5 million was safely quarantined within government servers, and the cartel routing architecture was completely exposed. Mitchell looked at me with a profound, silent respect. We had just executed one of the most daring financial interceptions in federal history directly from my private study. But the night was far from over. The digital clock on the wall glowed silently, ticking past 3 a.m. The cartel deadline had officially expired. We did not have to wait long for the inevitable fallout. When my cybersecurity team had swept the mansion earlier, they had not just dismantled Monica's hidden cameras. They had hijacked them, reversing the feeds to broadcast directly into my command center. I tapped a sequence of keys on my laptop, pulling up the live audio and video stream from the master bedroom upstairs. The high-definition camera tucked invisibly inside the crown molding provided a perfect, terrifying view of my son descending into pure madness. Bradley was pacing violently across the plush carpet, his expensive silk pajamas completely soaked in cold sweat. His laptop sat on the edge of the unmade king bed, the screen still glowing with the stark red error message indicating a critical, catastrophic system failure. He had been frantically hitting the refresh key for the past 30 minutes, utterly paralyzed by the sudden, inexplicable severing of his administrative credentials. Monica was sitting up against the headboard, clutching a thick comforter to her chest, her face pale and drawn. She was peppering him with sharp, anxious questions, demanding to know why the wire transfer had not cleared the final international node. Bradley ignored her, dragging his trembling hands through his hair, muttering frantic, fragmented curses under his breath. He could not comprehend how a banking mainframe he believed he controlled had suddenly locked him out just seconds before his salvation. The tension in the bedroom was so thick, it practically crackled through the audio feed. Then exactly at 3:30 in the morning, a sharp, buzzing vibration shattered the heavy silence. It was not his personal smartphone. It was a cheap, disposable burner phone buried deep inside the pocket of his discarded travel jacket. Bradley froze, his entire body going completely rigid. He stared at the jacket as if it contained a live explosive. The buzzing continued, relentless and demanding. Monica let out a small, terrified gasp, pressing her hands over her mouth. With slow, agonizing dread, my son walked over to the jacket, reached into the pocket, and pulled out the small black device. He pressed the accept button and brought it to his ear with a shaking hand. He did not say a word. He just listened. Through the highly sensitive microphone array in the bedroom, I could hear the faint, distorted voice crackling through the receiver. It was the same terrifyingly polite man from the audio transcripts, but the false courtesy had been entirely stripped away. "The deadline has passed, Bradley," the voice stated, flat and hollow. "The designated accounts remain empty." Bradley stammered, his voice cracking, as he desperately tried to explain the sudden network failure, begging for just a few more hours to resolve the corporate glitch. The man on the other end cut him off with a single sharp word. "There are no more extensions," the voice dictated. "The penalty for theft is absolute. We have a retrieval team currently holding position on the perimeter of your neighborhood. You have exactly 1 hour to manually deliver the funds, or they will enter the estate. Do not attempt to run." The call disconnected with a sharp, heavy click. Bradley dropped the phone onto the floor, stumbling backward until his spine hit the edge of a heavy wooden dresser. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving, as the crushing reality of his impending death finally settled over him. Monica sprang from the bed, grabbing his shoulders and screaming at him to fix the problem, to call his banking contacts, to do absolutely anything to save their lives. But Bradley pushed her away, his eyes wide and completely unfocused. He scrambled back to the bed, grabbing his laptop with frantic, desperate energy. If the cartel hitman were an hour away, his only remaining option was to force his way back into the corporate mainframe and manually push the $5 million through a different channel. He sat on the floor, his fingers hammering the keys, as he launched a rapid diagnostic trace on the internal network. He needed to know what external entity had severed his connection. Was it the bank fraud department? Was it a random server crash? I watched him run a trace protocol, following the digital breadcrumbs backward through the local network. He was looking for the source of the critical system failure, the exact origin point of the lockout command. In my study, Agent Mitchell leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the back of my leather chair. "He is running an internal trace," Mitchell observed, his gravelly voice low and calm. "He is going to find the override source." I did not attempt to mask my location or scramble the internal routing paths. I wanted him to find it. I wanted him to know exactly who had pulled the floor out from under him. On the video feed, I watched the diagnostic results populate across Bradley's screen. The trace bounced from the corporate servers directly back to the local residential router, funneling straight into a specific isolated IP address within the mansion network. Bradley stared at the screen, his mouth falling open in complete, unadulterated shock. He read the hardware identification tag assigned to the IP address. It was the primary desktop terminal located in my private study on the ground floor. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The catastrophic system failure was not a bank error or an external cyber attack. It was a localized, highly targeted lockout, initiated from inside the house. And there was only one person currently residing on the ground floor. Monica, who had been pacing frantically behind him, stopped and looked over his shoulder. She saw the location tag glowing brightly on the screen. Her eyes widened, shifting from the laptop to Bradley's pale, terrified face. "That is the study," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute disbelief. "Harrison is in the study." Bradley slowly closed the laptop, his hands no longer shaking. The paralyzing fear that had consumed him moments ago was suddenly replaced by a dark, volatile rage. The puzzle pieces finally aligned perfectly in his panicked mind. His father was not a frail, demented old man slipping into the quiet oblivion of cognitive decay. His father was awake, perfectly lucid, and holding the digital keys to the empire. The sudden realization that I had intentionally doomed him pushed him entirely over the edge of reason. He stood up, turning his back, and marched toward my study door. Bradley reached the heavy oak door of my study. He did not knock. He grabbed the brass handle and twisted it violently, but the reinforced deadbolts I had engaged earlier held firm. He rattled the knob again, his breathing heavy and ragged, echoing through the thick wood. "Dad," he called out, his voice a frantic, wavering pitch. "Dad, open this door right now. We have a massive system failure on the corporate network. I need you to unlock the terminal." I sat silently in my leather chair, watching the security feed that displayed the hallway just outside my sanctuary. Bradley was staring at the wood, his chest heaving. He pounded his fist against the paneling. "Open the door," he shouted, the thin veneer of the concerned son beginning to crack and peel away. When I did not respond, the silence in the hallway stretched incredibly tight. While Bradley assaulted the door, Monica was entirely consumed by her own desperate survival instincts. On the secondary monitor, I watched her scramble around the master bedroom, frantically tossing designer clothes into a leather travel bag. If the cartel was coming, she fully intended to run, leaving Bradley to face the executioners alone. She grabbed her smartphone, her fingers flying across the screen as she attempted to transfer the remaining balances from their joint accounts into her private, untouchable offshore reserve. Suddenly, she stopped. Her face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure horror. The screen flashed a stark, uncompromising message: "Account frozen." She quickly pulled a premium platinum credit card from her wallet and attempted to book a private charter flight out of the city. Declined. She tried another card. Declined. The financial execution I had initiated hours ago was absolute. I had systematically dismantled their entire financial existence. Monica dropped the phone, letting out a raw, guttural scream of pure rage. She ran out of the bedroom and sprinted down the grand staircase, her bare feet slapping loudly against the polished mahogany steps. She found Bradley standing outside my study, his face flushed with panicked exertion. "They are gone!" Monica shrieked, grabbing Bradley by the collar of his silk pajamas. "The accounts are frozen. My cards are declining." He took everything. Bradley stared at her, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. The digital clock on my terminal ticked over to 4:30 in the morning. They had exactly 30 minutes before the cartel hit squad breached the estate gates. The terrifying reality of their situation finally obliterated whatever remained of their human decency. The polite, loving facade they had meticulously maintained for months completely evaporated. They were no longer the dutiful son and the caring daughter-in-law. They were cornered, desperate animals trapped in a cage of their own making, facing a brutal, imminent slaughter. Bradley pushed Monica aside with a vicious shove, his eyes darting wildly around the hallway. He turned and sprinted toward the attached garage. He returned less than 2 minutes later, his hands gripping the rubber handle of a heavy, long-handled steel mallet. It was a demolition tool, brutal and unforgiving. He marched back to my study door, his face contorted into a snarl of absolute murderous greed. "Open the door, you pathetic old man!" Bradley roared, swinging the heavy steel mallet backward. He brought it crashing down against the solid oak with a deafening, thunderous boom. The thick wood shuddered, but the reinforced core held strong. "Open the door and give me the override codes," he screamed, bringing the mallet down a second time. The brass handle rattled violently. "I need that money. It is my money. I earned it working for your archaic, stagnant company. Give me the codes, or I swear to God I will beat you to death myself before they even get here." In the study, Agent Mitchell stood perfectly still, his hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered sidearm. He watched the monitor with cold, professional detachment as Bradley continued his frantic, violent assault. Monica joined the frenzy, slamming her fists against the doorframe. "We know you are in there, you stubborn fool," she shrieked, her voice a piercing, hysterical wail. "You should have just died quietly. I should have tripled the dose in your tea. You are a useless, broken burden. Give us the money so we can leave." They were confessing to everything, screaming their absolute guilt into the hallway, completely unaware that every single vicious threat, every admission of poisoning, and every violent strike of the mallet was being recorded in pristine high-definition audio and video by the federal agents sitting quietly just a few feet away. Bradley swung the heavy steel mallet a third time, stepping completely into the swing to maximize the devastating impact. The heavy steel head slammed into the center panel of the door, producing an awful, tearing crunch. The thick oak began to buckle under the tremendous repeated force, long, jagged splinters of expensive wood exploding outward into the hallway. I watched the physical destruction of my home with total, unblinking composure. I felt absolutely nothing for the man swinging the hammer. The illusion of my family was completely dead, pulverized by the brutal reality of their inherent, irredeemable selfishness. They did not care about my legacy, my health, or my life. They only cared about their own survival and the stolen wealth they believed they were entitled to possess. The digital clock on the central monitor shifted forward, marking the passing seconds with ruthless, unstoppable precision. Time was rapidly bleeding away. "Give me the codes," Bradley shrieked, his voice hoarse and raw, his chest heaving with exhaustion as he raised the mallet for another crushing blow. "I will tear this entire house apart to get to you right now." Monica stood directly behind him. Her manicured hands clenched tightly into trembling fists. Her face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, ugly desperation. "Break it down," she urged him, her voice dripping with venomous, uncontrolled hatred. "Break it down and make him type the override numbers. He is weak, he is old, and he will do absolutely whatever we tell him to do once we finally get our hands on him." Bradley grunted heavily, bringing the thick demolition mallet down with staggering, terrifying force directly against the brass deadbolt lock housing. The solid metal plate groaned loudly, bending slightly under the immense concentrated pressure of the blow. A thick, splintering crack propagated straight up the center of the heavy door, revealing a tiny sliver of the bright hallway light beyond. The physical barrier standing between us was slowly, inevitably failing. The sheer violence of their coordinated assault was a powerful testament to the absolute depths of their moral depravity. They were completely unhinged, driven entirely by the primal consuming terror of the impending cartel executioners. The 30-minute deadline was rapidly, mercilessly shrinking toward zero. In my secured sanctuary, the two federal analysts continued typing silently, meticulously logging every threat. Agent Mitchell did not flinch as the wood splintered loudly. He simply looked at me. "Let them exhaust themselves," I whispered softly. The massive door bowed inward, the heavy hinges whining under the relentless strain. The final blow struck with the concussive force of a detonating bomb. The heavy brass lock plate sheared completely away from the splintered wood, sailing across the study and clattering against the far wall. The massive oak door violently burst open, rebounding off the bookshelf with a sickening crash. Bradley stumbled forward into the room, his chest heaving, his silk pajamas drenched in sweat and covered in the pale dust of shattered wood. He gripped the heavy steel mallet tightly in both hands, his eyes wild and completely consumed by the primal terror of a truly cornered, desperate wild animal. Monica flanked him immediately, panting heavily, her face a twisted portrait of absolute desperation. They charged into what they believed was the final stronghold of a weak, terrified old man. They expected to find me cowering behind my desk, trembling, and ready to surrender the very codes that would save their miserable lives. Instead, the scene that greeted them froze the blood in their veins. The digital clock on the wall shifted to exactly 5 in the morning. I was not cowering. I was comfortably seated in my favorite leather armchair, my legs casually crossed, feeling perfectly and completely relaxed. In my right hand, I held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with a generous pour of aged scotch. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich, smoky liquid warm my throat. I looked at my son and his wife, my face an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. The room was not dark and defenseless. It was brightly illuminated by the cool blue glow of the Federal Command Center. Bradley stopped dead in his tracks, the heavy mallet slowly lowering, as his eyes darted from the array of high-definition monitors to the two focused federal analysts typing silently away. Before his fractured mind could even begin to process the magnitude of his fatal error, a figure detached itself from the deep shadows near the window. Special Agent Victor Mitchell stepped forward into the light. He did not draw his weapon, but his mere presence commanded the entire room with a heavy, suffocating authority. "Drop the hammer right now." Agent Mitchell ordered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that resonated with the promise of absolute violence. Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but the words completely died in his throat as the heavy French doors leading outside shattered into pieces. The glass exploded inward in a shower of brilliant diamonds. A highly coordinated tactical team poured into the study with terrifying surgical precision. The room was instantly flooded with harsh tactical lights and the sharp overlapping shouts of federal agents commanding total compliance. It was a perfectly orchestrated avalanche of overwhelming force. Bradley dropped the mallet, the heavy steel thudding against the carpet, as two heavily armored agents violently spun him around and slammed him face first into the mahogany wall. Monica let out a piercing, hysterical shriek as she was simultaneously swept entirely off her bare, trembling feet today. Her arms were roughly wrenched behind her back and secured with heavy plastic ties. They were pressed hard against the expensive wallpaper as completely subdued and entirely powerless. The tactical team cleared the perimeter in seconds, securing the mansion, while Agent Mitchell stepped directly into my son's line of sight. Bradley was gasping for air, his cheek mashed against the wood paneling, but his eyes frantically found mine. The initial shock was rapidly giving way to a desperate, calculating fury. He realized the cartel was not coming, But he also realized he was staring at a major federal criminal indictment now. "You cannot do this to me!" Bradley screamed, thrashing wildly against the heavy hands pinning him to the wall. I did nothing wrong. It was him. He is the founder. He is the chief executive. He authorized every single transfer. I am just the proxy. He signed the legal documents. He gave me the authority to move the money. I am fully protected. He was shouting to the federal agents, frantically trying to spin the narrative, desperately clinging to the fraudulent legal shield he thought he had so cleverly secured. He truly believed he could quickly drag me completely down. He wanted to pull me into the abyss right alongside him. I took another slow, appreciative sip of my scotch. I placed the crystal tumbler gently onto the mahogany desk, the soft clink silencing his frantic shouting. I stood up, smoothing the front of my cardigan, and walked slowly across the room until I was standing just inches away from his sweating, desperate face. "You always were a remarkably sloppy student of business, Bradley," I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet carrying the absolute weight of a finalized execution. "Do you honestly believe I would suddenly fold today? Do you think I would spend 40 years building an international empire only to leave the keys under the mat for a greedy, incompetent child?" I reached into the inner pocket of my cardigan and produced the original physical copy of the durable power of attorney he had forced me to sign before leaving for Aspen. I unfolded the heavy legal paper and held it up directly in front of his eyes. I pointed to the bottom of the page, tracing the jagged, trembling lines of my signature. "Look very closely at the blue ink," I instructed him extremely coldly. When I signed this document, I intentionally botched the primary keystrokes of my legal signature. I reversed the angle of the ascenders and omitted the secondary loop. It is a completely invalid legal mark. Any basic corporate forensic audit would instantly flag this as a profound, undeniable forgery. Bradley stared at the paper, his breathing growing shallow and rapid as the terrifying reality of his situation began to sink its teeth into his mind. But I did not stop there. I gestured toward the glowing monitors where the federal analysts had compiled a massive, damning digital evidence portfolio file tonight. Furthermore, I continued, my tone entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. "You and your wife spent the last 6 months meticulously gathering evidence to prove that my cognitive functions were rapidly decaying. Monica recorded my supposed dementia, logging every dropped glass and every vacant stare. She sent those files along with fabricated medical records to a private psychiatric institution in a brilliant effort to have me involuntarily committed." Monica began to sob loudly, a wet, pathetic sound that echoed miserably against the walls, but I kept my eyes locked entirely on my son. "You provided the federal government agents everything. You gave them a perfect, bulletproof legal defense on my behalf," I explained, enjoying the absolute terror blooming in his wide eyes. "A man suffering from advanced dementia cannot legally authorize a $5 million corporate wire transfer to an international crime syndicate. You cannot use a document obtained from a medically compromised individual." Bradley sagged against the wall, the fight completely draining out of his muscles. "Every illegal transaction leads directly back to your devices alone." Monica begged for mercy loudly. I ignored her completely. I picked up my drink and sipped my scotch, feeling entirely unbothered right now. The heavy oak door lay in splintered ruins on the plush carpet, a violent testament to the absolute greed that had completely consumed my son. Bradley stared at me, his eyes wide and vacant, as the crushing weight of his colossal failure finally broke his arrogant spirit. The highly trained federal agents did not give him a single moment to process his devastating defeat. They hauled him roughly up from the mahogany floor, securing his wrists tightly behind his back with thick plastic cuffs. Monica was still screaming, her voice a shrill, piercing wail that echoed endlessly down the long, opulent hallway. She looked directly at me, dark mascara tears streaming down her pale, terrified face, begging frantically for mercy, pleading for me to stop the armed agents from taking her away to a cold prison cell. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my aged scotch, letting the rich, smoky liquid warm my throat. I felt entirely unbothered by her pathetic display. I simply watched as the tactical team marched my treacherous son and his calculating wife out of my magnificent home, their frantic, desperate apologies fading harmlessly into the cold morning air. Special Agent Mitchell gave me a brief, deeply respectful nod before following his elite team out into the darkness, leaving me perfectly alone in the comforting, absolute silence of my reclaimed sanctuary. I sat quietly in my leather chair, for a long time breathing in the comforting scent of aged oak and expensive scotch. The fierce adrenaline that had fueled me through the violent night slowly dissipated, leaving behind a profound, unwavering sense of clarity. The dark nightmare was finally over. The ungrateful parasites were gone forever. I had successfully reclaimed my life, and I had absolutely no intention of ever letting anyone threaten my peaceful existence again. The following weeks were a chaotic whirlwind of meticulous legal execution and undeniable federal justice. The elaborate digital trap we had set worked with absolute devastating perfection. The intercepted wire transfer provided the Federal Bureau of Investigation with the exact routing architecture they desperately needed to systematically dismantle the entire international money laundering syndicate. Dozens of highly coordinated tactical raids were executed simultaneously across the country, sweeping up the dangerous, violent men who had dared to threaten my home. But my primary focus remained entirely fixed on the brutal, inescapable consequences facing Bradley and Monica. They were swiftly and formally indicted on a massive array of severe federal charges. The evidence against them was utterly insurmountable. The pristine audio and video recordings secretly captured from my own security system proved their malicious, murderous intent beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt. The prosecution aggressively charged them with federal racketeering, extensive wire fraud, and the chilling, premeditated, attempted murder of a vulnerable family member by systematic chemical poisoning. There were no plea deals offered, and there was absolutely no leniency granted by the presiding judge. My son and my daughter-in-law are currently facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 long years in a bleak maximum security federal penitentiary. They will spend the prime decades of their lives locked in tiny concrete cells, entirely stripped of the unearned luxury they were so desperately eager to steal from me. With the immediate physical threat permanently neutralized, I turned my undivided, ruthless attention back to the massive logistics empire I had spent 40 grueling years building from the ground up. Bradley had not acted entirely alone in his corporate sabotage. His rampant, toxic corruption had quietly infected several key members of my executive board. These weak men had looked the other way intentionally, ignoring his blatant financial irregularities, in exchange for quiet, highly lucrative offshore kickbacks. I marched into the towering corporate headquarters with a team of elite corporate attorneys and purged the internal rot with absolute unforgiving efficiency. I fired the complicit board members right on the spot, severing their lucrative contracts and handing their encrypted internal communications directly over to the waiting federal investigators. I completely refused to let my pristine legacy be tainted by their spineless, pathetic greed. To quickly fill the massive void left in the executive suite, I did not hire expensive, arrogant consultants from the outside world. Instead, I looked deep into the loyal, hard-working ranks of my own company. I elevated the dedicated junior staff members who had kept their heads down and remained perfectly honest while my son was actively attempting to burn the entire company to the ground. I rewarded their quiet integrity with unprecedented executive promotions and profound financial trust, completely rebuilding the corporate hierarchy with men and women who actually respected the immense, grueling hard work required to maintain a legitimate, thriving international enterprise. When the corporate fires were finally extinguished and the heavy dust of the relentless legal battles began to settle, I returned to the sweeping, quiet solitude of my grand residential estate. The massive, sprawling house felt entirely different to me now. It was no longer a beautiful, suffocating cage filled with constant deceit, whispered threats, and manufactured illness. It had become a fortified fortress of pure, unadulterated peace. I walked slowly through the grand dining room, my steady footsteps echoing softly against the polished, gleaming hardwood floors. I hired a specialized, highly discreet landscaping team to carefully remove the large decorative fern that had dutifully absorbed the toxic poison tea Monica had so viciously brewed for me. I had it immediately replaced with a magnificent thriving indoor ficus tree, a vibrant green living symbol of my fully restored health and my absolute undeniable triumph over their sinister, greedy plotting. I stood by the large bay window in the front parlor, looking out over the rolling, perfectly manicured lawns as the warm evening sun dipped beautifully below the distant tree line. I poured myself another small glass of my favorite aged scotch, swirling the amber liquid slowly. I had survived a calculated betrayal that would have completely destroyed a much weaker man. I had protected my vast commercial empire, preserved my own life, and completely eliminated the toxic predators who had falsely disguised themselves as my loving family. The profound silence enveloping the mansion was no longer lonely or isolating. It was the beautiful, triumphant, and eternal sound of absolute victory. Listen closely, because this is the hardest truth a self-made man will ever have to swallow. You cannot buy character, and you cannot subsidize loyalty. When you hand someone the world on a silver platter, without forcing them to earn it, they will not appreciate the silver. They will just complain that it is heavy. Wealth is a magnifying glass. It simply amplifies who people truly are. Protect your peace, protect your legacy, and never ignore your gut instinct. If someone ever treats your life work like their personal bank account, cut the cord before they cut your throat. If my story struck a chord with you today, please hit that like button to support this growing channel. Subscribe right now so you do not miss the next hard-hitting life story. Tell me in the comments section below. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members? Let us talk down below.